It was simply another typical evening. I was sprawled out on my sofa, partly watching an action movie that I had watched a dozen times previously after finishing my meal and taking a fast shower. The kind of film that you play only for background noise. For the last several hours, my phone had been left unattended on a coffee table. I didn't anticipate receiving any messages, much less any visits. Then my door was knocked on at precisely midnight. I first believed I was dreaming. I sat up, turned the TV down and listened. 3 slow, purposeful taps, another knock. A shiver went through my body. I never had someone show up at my house without warning, much less this late. Hesitantly, I got up. My first reaction was to disregard it. It may have been a drunk neighbor at the wrong door, or it might have been something more serious. However, curiosity prevailed. My stomach fell as I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Margaret was the one. She was standing there with her eyes swollen and red, her hair a little untidy, and a big coat over her typical casual outfit. She had a half-empty bottle of wine in one hand. As if aware that I was observing, she glanced up at the peephole. I opened the door after unlocking it. Margaret. Her mouth quivered. "John, hello," she spoke haltingly. She chuckled nervously. I hope you're not bothered by me." "Oh, no," I said. I was still trying to take in what I was seeing. "What's happening? Are you all right?" Her shoulders slumped as she sighed. "May I enter?" I paused for a moment. This was strange, very strange. I was never that close to Margaret. Yes, we got along, but Joseph was the reason we were friends. I never saw her outside of Joseph's presence. She seemed to have been sobbing for hours as she stood by herself at my door. I was not going to turn her away, however. Of course. When she entered, I shut the door behind her. She placed the bottle on the coffee table and sat down heavily as I ushered her to the sofa. She rubbed her sleeve over her face and laughed nervously again. God, I must seem to be a complete disaster. She was seated across from me. "Do you wish to explain the situation to me?" She nodded and looked at the bottle for a while before looking directly into my eyes. "John. Joseph. He betrayed me." I blinked. "What?" "With my closest pal. They were visible to me. They were united when I spotted them." The last phrase caused her voice to break, and new tears filled her eyes. Angrily, she wiped them away. I arrived home sooner than planned. Something slipped off, even though I had no intention of doing so, and they were there when I entered. My thoughts were racing as I sat back. "Are you sure, Margaret?" She chuckled bitterly. I wish I wasn't. I was at a loss for words. This was enormous. Joseph, my closest pal, he didn't seem to be the kind. He cherished Margaret, or I believed that he did. He was often talking about her. He never expressed dissatisfaction with their union. Margaret, however, was sitting here, looking absolutely broken. I cleared my throat. "Have you spoken to him?" "No." She gave a swift shake of her head. I was unable to. So I bolted from there. I was unsure about where to go. I thus arrived here. She gave a whiff. To be honest, I'm not really sure why. Someone who wasn't lying to me was what I needed to see. Her remarks were like a kick to the stomach. I was at a loss for words. What was I meant to do in this place? Assist her? Inform her that she was exaggerating? Tell her that Joseph, the man I had put my confidence in for years, couldn't possibly do this? I rubbed my hands together. As I leaned forward, "Listen, Margaret, I'm at a loss for words. That's a lot. Are you certain you saw what you saw after all?" Her gaze became gloomy. "Do you mean that I'm making this up?" No, I'm not saying that." I let out a sigh. My best pal is Joseph. He's never even looked at another lady like that, as far as I can tell." Margaret laughed bitterly again. "Yes, I didn't either, right up till tonight." There was silence between us. The room echoed with the weight of her words. I didn't know how to deal with this. At last, I grabbed the wine bottle. I replied, taking off the cap. "All right. Let's begin from the very beginning. Tell me everything." She nodded and let out a deep sigh. "All right." I was suddenly drawn into something I had not anticipated. I couldn't help but notice Margaret's shaking hands as she began to speak. Despite her best efforts, it was obvious that she was struggling to contain her emotions. She continued to fiddle with the wine bottle between us, her eyes downcast. I have no idea what I was anticipating. Her voice was hushed as she began, but I simply froze when I saw them as I stepped in. I sat there trying to take in what she had said, but I couldn't get beyond the same thing. Joseph, my closest companion. I'd known him for years, the person who had always been the epitome of devotion. This can't be real, can it? I massaged my face. You saw them together then. What precisely took place? Margaret's eyes were crimson and filled with a mixture of anguish and rage as she stared up at me. They were seated on the sofa as I entered. She was being kissed by Joseph. Rachel is my best buddy. She stopped and took a trembling breath. John, I have no idea why she would do this to me. I mistook her for a buddy. However, they were there as if it didn't exist. I have first-hand experience of them. I was at a loss for words. My head was whirling. Rachel? The wife of his closest friend? This was illogical. It didn't. After that, did you speak with him? Trying to keep my voice calm, I asked. I was unable. I just ran out. I was at a loss as to what to say to him. After something like that, how can you even look someone in the eye? She dabbed at her face. She seemed more worn out than I had ever seen her. I was meant to have faith in him. Rachel was supposed to be trustworthy, and now it's all simply smashed. Uncomfortably, I moved. Something has to be said. Perhaps it's not what it looks, but I'm not sure. Perhaps there is a miscommunication. Margaret gave a fierce shake of her head. They were visible to me. Everyone. Of them was all over the others. John, I know what I saw. She leaned closer and gave me an intense, desperate gaze. From here, I have no idea where to go. I'm at a loss on what to do. I believed that Joseph would always be there for me. Now, however, her voice faltered as she drifted off. My chest felt constricted. This was not meant to be taking place. I had no idea how to make it better. I had no idea if it could be corrected. As she went on, all I could do was listen. John, I have no idea why I got here. I just have no other people. She tried to conceal it by averting her gaze when her voice broke. I had no idea to whom else to turn. I breathed out slowly. You're aware that you could speak with me. She looked directly into my eyes, but something about them seemed off. I wasn't prepared for it. I understand, she muttered. I just had nowhere else to go. The quiet dragged on once again. Now the room was heavier. I was unsure of what to believe and what to think. Joseph always had my support. Always have faith in him. This scenario just seemed unfeasible. She spoke very gently. My name, John. Can I spend tonight here? At least till I decide what to do. Next, I didn't think twice. You are welcome to remain as long as you need to. However, I had a pit in my stomach as soon as I spoke. Isn't this incorrect? This was tricky, but I was being a good friend. Even though Joseph was my closest friend, I found myself and his wife in the midst of a crisis that was upending all I believed to be true about them. The wine bottle remained in her hands, now gripped tightly as if it were a lifeline. Thank you, John, she responded in an emotionally charged voice. Without you here, I'm not sure what I would have done. I nodded to her, unsure of how to console her. I wasn't prepared for this kind of situation. Margaret, it's okay. We'll work it out. I'll assist in whatever way I can. However, something nagged in the back of my mind as I said the words. The numbers didn't add up. Why hadn't Joseph informed me about it if he had really done what she was saying? Why hadn't he made contact? And why had Margaret approached me of all people? I ignored the thoughts for the time being. I wasn't going to abandon her. She needed aid. All I needed to do was find out what the heck was going on. However, I had a sneaking suspicion that things were about to grow much more problematic. Margaret was moving about in the kitchen when I woke up the next morning. We were up, even though it was too early for anybody to be awake. It was a weird, tense environment. She hadn't slept well, and I could tell. Really, neither had I. I continued to review everything in my mind in an attempt to make sense of it all. After wiping my eyes, I stood up and made my way to the kitchen. Margaret was making herself a cup of coffee as she stood at the counter. Her eyes were bloodshot. "Good morning," I murmured, sounding a bit sleepy. She turned and smiled feebly. "I didn't intend to wake you, Morning," I said. "You didn't?" Even though my head was feeling hazy from lack of sleep, I also had trouble falling asleep. Margaret gave a nod, then absently swirled the contents in her cup. "John, I'm at a loss for what to do." I watched her while leaning against the doorframe. I understand that it's a lot to process, but even though I wanted to reassure her, I couldn't help but feel as like I was lacking something. There was something wrong with all of this. I tried to seem comforting as I added, "Listen, I'll speak with Joe. I'll see what transpired. I'll make sure you know the truth if he did anything." Margaret looked directly into my eyes, almost begging. "Tell me whether it's real, please, John. I just cannot endure this state of uncertainty." I gave a nod. "I will speak with him. I swear." I struggled to think clearly throughout the day, knowing that I had to confront Joseph. I trusted him like a brother since we had been friends for years. How is this possible? Was everything misunderstood? Was Margaret being honest? Or what? I contacted Joseph that evening to ask if we could get together after a long day of uncertainty. Almost instantly, he replied, recommending that we have a drink at the regular bar. My mind was racing with uncontrollable ideas as I drove to the bar. In addition to what Margaret had told me, I was anxious because regardless of the reality, I knew that this would be a turning point in my life. Joseph was already there when I got there, drinking a beer while seated at a table. As I walked up, he glanced up and nodded absently. He responded, "Hey man," in a firm voice, but I could sense that something wasn't quite right. "Hey," I said, taking a seat across from him, "do you have a moment?" After taking a sip of his drink, Joseph put it down. "Yes, what's going on?" In an attempt to regain my composure, I inhaled deeply. "It concerns Margaret." His expression shifted instantly. I could see that he was tense because his eyes expanded a little. "How about her?" I lowered my voice and leaned in a little. "She spent yesterday night at my house. She claimed to have seen something, claimed to have been with Rachel, that you had been unfaithful to her." Joseph's expression became pallid. He was silent for a minute, simply staring at me. "What on earth are you discussing?" With a harsh voice, he finally managed to utter it. "She claimed to have seen Rachel and you together, that you were sharing a kiss." As I spoke, I could feel my stomach churning. Man, she was quite unhappy. Joseph reclined, a look of bewilderment and incredulity on his face. "I have no idea where she got it from, John. It isn't accurate. I was faithful to her. I promise." I attempted to read his expression as I looked at him, but there was no sign of dishonesty. His gaze were unwavering and his voice was forceful. "It didn't happen, and I'm not sure why she would claim that." Joseph went on. "I've always been pals with Rachel, not much more." I breathed out slowly. "However, why would she fabricate such a story?" Joseph looked tired as he wiped his face. "I don't know, dude. I am at a loss for words." She seemed to have lost her temper. I took a time to sit there and think about what he had said. It was illogical. Margaret had come to me looking so sure, so devastated. Joseph was now certain that it was untrue. "John, I'm telling you." His voice was quiet as he added, "Nothing is happening between Rachel and myself. I'm not being unfaithful to Margaret." Before I spoke again, I stared at him for a long while. "All okay, but I still don't get it. If all of above were untrue, why would Margaret say it?" Joseph stopped, obviously pondering. "I'm not sure. However, you must speak with her. Investigate it thoroughly." I gave a nod. I was forced to. However, I was still unsure of whom to trust. I also had a pal named Margaret, and if that wasn't true, I had to find out why she would make such a charge. My thoughts were still racing as I walked out of the pub. Did Joseph tell the truth, or was there another event taking on here? I needed to know. However, I feared that the answers might be more complicated than I had anticipated. It was becoming more difficult to perceive the reality, and everything seems to become more convoluted the more I probed. The days that followed seemed to go very quickly. My thoughts kept returning to what Joseph had said. He maintained that he and Rachel were not involved in any relationship. However, there was still something wrong with the scenario. Margaret had been so sure of her vision, and the picture of her tear-streaked face when she arrived at my door kept coming back to me. I made an effort to get in touch with Margaret after that night at the pub. However, she was not returning my calls. felt irritated. However, I was also aware that I couldn't simply let things hang. I had to speak with her, have a serious conversation with her. I so made the decision to visit her home. I doubted she would even allow me in. However, I tried. There was silence in the drive over. My mind was jumbled, and my stomach nodded more and more at each turn. After taking a big breath, I knocked on her door and heard her footsteps coming from inside. She looked different when she opened it. She still had crimson eyes. However, her face had become rather icy, as if she had erected a barrier to keep herself safe. "John, what are you doing here?" Her voice was flat as she asked. It seemed as if she was attempting to put herself at a remove. "I came to speak." I tried to sound calm as I spoke. However, my heart was racing. I must comprehend. "Tell me what happened, please." Margaret paused, looking back inside her apartment as if she was unsure whether or not to open the door for me. At last, she moved aside and gestured for me to enter. For a while, we sat in quiet. She was clearly having trouble coming up with anything to say. Before speaking, she fumbled with her fingers and glanced at the floor. "I have no idea how to describe it," she began, a little trembling in her voice. "John, I saw them together. Joe and Rachel were in the restaurant when I noticed them. They were too near. I then saw them sharing a kiss. My heart fell." "Are you certain, though? Perhaps there was a miscommunication." Margaret shook her head, her eyes beginning to flood up with tears once again. "No, what I witnessed is known to me. I thought I was losing my mind. Why he would do that to me is beyond me. Why would he do such a betrayal?" Her voice was so hurtful that I couldn't ignore it. However, I was also having trouble understanding what Joseph had told me. He vowed that it was untrue. I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I was unable to disregard Margaret's suffering, however. I visited him. Her voice was suddenly softer as she went on. I questioned him about it. However, he just did, not refuted. He pretended it didn't matter. As if I were the insane one, my blood ran cold at that. That had never been Joseph. Yes, he was somewhat aloof, but anything this important would never be dismissed by him. "Margaret," I responded, attempting to sound steady. "Joe assured me he didn't be unfaithful." "It's not true," he replied. Her eyes were wide with shock as she gazed up at me. "Did you speak with him? That's what he said." "Yes," I said. "There was nothing between him and Rachel," he vowed, "that they are only companions." Margaret's expression contorted, the pain mingled with perplexity and frustration. "Why would he say that, though? He would lie to you, but why?" For that, I had no response. The truth seemed so far away. It was difficult to see Margaret slide out of control. She was no longer just wounded. She was determined to understand everything. I suggested that he could be reluctant to acknowledge it, but I wasn't convinced. That was hardly the kind of thing Joseph would keep hidden. Once again, Margaret shook her head. "John, I'm at a loss for what to think. I think I'm going insane." I knew I had to maintain my distance from her, but I still wanted to soothe her. Fixing this wasn't my responsibility. Even if I had feelings for her, I wasn't the one who had been deceived. "Look," I responded firmly, "I'll speak with Joseph again. I'll discover the true situation." Margaret nodded slightly, almost in despair. "Just tell me the truth, please." I kept having the uneasy sense that something wasn't right as I walked out of her place. Margaret's tale didn't fit Joseph's, and the more I considered it, the less it made sense. Had Margaret fabricated it all? Or was there anything Joseph was concealing? I was unsure of how to overcome the intense tension between them. However, I had to make an effort since I couldn't allow my closest buddy and his wife to break up without knowing the whole truth. However, I couldn't help but wonder now, was I entering a scenario that was more significant than I had ever thought? And might I be caught in the center if I wasn't careful? I had to try one last time to understand what was really happening. My thoughts were still filled with Margaret's distress, and even though Joseph maintained that nothing had occurred, I still felt uneasy about the whole circumstance. Until I found out, I couldn't let it go. That morning I gave Joseph a call and invited him to meet. Although it wasn't my first attempt, I wasn't going to give up this time. He agreed to meet me at one of our favorite coffee shops. I arrived. Early, my heart pounding. Despite my nervousness, I knew I wanted answers. He seemed exactly the same when he entered. composed, calm, as if nothing were wrong. However, I could sense a problem. Perhaps it was the anxious energy that appeared to linger about him, or the way he avoided making eye contact. But whatever was happening, it was obvious that he wasn't telling the truth. I tried to be informal when I said, "Hey man," but my voice sounded forced. "You must be honest with me. What became of Margaret?" He moved in his chair uneasily. I sensed the strain in the air as he took a while to respond. It seemed as if he was considering coming clean, but I couldn't afford to wait for him to decide. "Look," I said, "I spoke with Margaret. What she observed, she told me. All of this has caused her great pain. She believes that you cheated on her by seeing Rachel." I lowered my voice as I moved closer. "She wants to know the truth. Joe, I must know whether it's true." "Is it?" A hand swept across Joseph's hair. His face was worried. He seemed conflicted, as if he wanted to tell me something but wasn't sure how to formulate it. He paused for a long while, then groaned and looked down at the table. Finally, he stated in a quiet voice, "John, I didn't cheat on her." "Nothing occurred between Rachel and myself, I promise. That's not me." I stared at him, expecting more, but it never materialized. Words weren't enough for me. I needed something tangible. Why, therefore, did Margaret believe she had seen something? Why did she approach me and accuse me of being unfaithful? Joseph's fingers clenched around his coffee cup, and his face became pale. "I'm not sure. She may have made it up, in my opinion. John, I'm not sure why she would do that, but it's the reality. I haven't betrayed her in any way. I wouldn't." A knot formed in my gut. I wasn't sure whether or not I trusted him, but suddenly my mind made a connection. Margaret had never been quite consistent. She had a tendency to overanalyze situations and exaggerate minor issues. Could her anxieties be the cause of all this? Had she constructed this whole narrative to support her anxieties, or did I witness just a portion of the story? Leaning back, I took in Joseph's words. Although a part of me still wanted to ask him more questions, I knew it was time to go on. "I trust you, at least for now." Even though the words felt heavier than I wanted them to, I eventually spoke them. But why she would lie about this is beyond me. Joseph's demeanor changed from one of relief to one of seriousness. "You must speak. With Margaret, John, you must learn the truth about her mental state. Her recent unusual behavior has led me to believe that she may be coping with another issue." I didn't expect to hear that at all. Joseph exuded calmness and confidence. But by anything different, what did he mean? I needed to know. I had more questions than answers when I left the coffee shop. Everything was complicated and I didn't know how to proceed. However, I was aware of one thing. I had to have a last conversation with Margaret. I couldn't let this go until everything was on the table, no matter how difficult it was. That afternoon, I took a car to her residence. My thoughts was racing and my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. How might I respond to her? Could Joseph have been correct? Could it be that Margaret was really keeping anything from me? Or from her? I had no idea what to anticipate when I knocked on her door. We both remained silent for a bit as she opened it. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept for days. This time, however, her eyes were filled with tiredness rather than rage. "Margaret, I must know the truth," I spoke in a stern yet calm tone. "You weren't cheated on by Joseph. I've spoken with him and I trust him. However, tell me what's really happening, please." Her face was inscrutable as she gazed at me for a considerable amount of time. Then, gently, she moved out of the way and gestured for me to enter. I waited as we sat down. After what seemed like a lifetime, Margaret finally said something. She shook her voice and mumbled, "John, I don't know why I did it. I made it up. I felt afraid. I was worried that I might lose him if I did nothing. I needed to feel in control, and I'm not sure why I felt that would help." I was taken aback. I was struck hard by the weight of her confession. This narrative has been promoted by her all along. Not Joseph, not Rachel. Everything had been ripped apart by her own anxieties. I was unsure of how to react. All I could feel was grief, even though I wanted to be outraged. This was more than simply a breach of confidence. She had betrayed herself. "I apologize," she replied quietly, her eyes welling with tears. "John, I was really afraid. I was at a loss for words to improve it. Sitting there with her, as the reality sunk in, was all I could do. There was no quick cure or simple remedy. At least the truth was now out, but Joseph and Margaret would still need to figure it out. I had a weird feeling of relief as I walked out of her place that night. Even if it wasn't the joyful ending I had hoped for, it did happen. And that's all any of us could hope for in the end.